Good evening and welcome to Tysky Sour. Our main story this evening is the horrific bombardment of Gaza by Israel. It's a topic which is covered pretty badly by most of our mainstream media. So we're going to try and have a more sensitive and realistic discussion of what is currently going on in Palestine. I'm going to speak to two brilliant guests to fill us in on the situation there. I'm also joined tonight by Ash Sarkar. How are you doing, Ash?
I'm all right, man. I was just missing you. Had to wait all the way to Wednesday to see you. You tried to cancel me, but I could not be cancelled.
I did not try to cancel you. It was a simple shift. Me and Ash are going to be talking about some of the ridiculous ways that the Israeli bombardment of Gaza and the generalized settler colonial occupation of Palestine is presented in the Western press, and how it has actually been called out very, very effectively twice recently live on air. In the second half of the show, we have some Labour stories for you. Keir Starmer's poor ratings, worse than Corbyn, and Peter Mandelson, Tony Blair, all those people you don't really want to hear from, but we're going to show you them because, why not? For now, to get us going, you know what to do. Do let us know your comments by tweeting on the hashtag TyskySour. And if you haven't already, do hit the subscribe button. First story. Gaza continues to suffer its most brutal Israeli bombardment since the war in 2014. It has so far left 53 Palestinians dead, including 13 children. Now, Israel claimed the airstrikes are in response to rockets from Hamas, which so far have killed 6 people in Israel. Now, the violence, while horrific for all involved, is often misleadingly reported in the West as a fair fight between two sides. That overlooks the fact that one side is an occupier and the other is the occupied. It also ignores that while Hamas's rockets rarely hit their targets, the airstrikes of the IDF do. This video shows the interception of Hamas rockets by Israel's Iron Dome air defense system. Meanwhile, Israeli bombs topple entire tower blocks.
خلك صور شو يا بابا لازم بالهان يا بابا.
Residents had been warned to evacuate that block before the bomb hit. Obviously, that warning will have saved lives. It won't bring back anyone's homes. The Times of Israel have reported that Hamas have sought to negotiate a ceasefire, an end to the bombardments and the rockets. However, Israel has made clear they have no intention of agreeing to one. Benny Gantz, who's Israel's defense minister, spoke earlier today and said the army will continue to attack to bring a total long-term quiet. Only when we reach that goal will we be able to speak about a truce. Now, these are really, really chilling words, and it's consistent with what has been Israel's strategy for a long term, which is essentially to maintain their own security by periodically bombarding any sites of resistance. It's a strategy which has been grimly labeled mowing the grass, highlighting the assumption that this will, presumably, they're assuming it will be done repeatedly, as we see with these periodic wars, these periodic bombardments of Gaza. Now, the bombardment of Gaza follows the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Sheikh Jarrah evictions, and a police crackdown on Palestinians assembling in Jerusalem, all issues we talked about on Monday's show. And this convergence of repression has now sparked widespread protest and unrest among Palestinian citizens of Israel. And to talk about that wider context, the uprising we're beginning to see in the region, I'm delighted to be joined by Riya Al-Sana, a Palestinian researcher and activist. Could I start by asking you what the situation is like in Israel at the moment? Obviously, the bombing of Gaza is an escalation of the repression against Palestinians. There are many Palestinian citizens in Israel, and I understand, unsurprisingly, this is leading to widespread protest, widespread unrest across the region.
Yes, well, I guess it's kind of important to put the background a little bit, and I guess maybe just a little bit of note on terminology, that when we're talking about the attacks on Gaza and what's happening in Gaza, I think it's important to talk about it in the context of an Israeli settler colonial project that has been going on for over 7 decades, and Palestinians are resisting. They're resisting in Gaza, they're resisting in Jerusalem, and they're resisting in Palestine 48. And we saw today also Palestinian refugees in the diaspora coming out. And I think Palestinians are resisting the myriad of policies that are inflicted upon us by the settler colonial regime, from expulsion in Sheikh Jarrah that hits very hard and deep for every Palestinian who has a history, has a story with the question of expulsion. It is the attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque as a place of worship, but also very important it has a very important political significance and cultural significance. Palestinians in 48 have been marginalized for decades. Really aggressive Israeli state policies of bringing them into the orbit of the Israeli state, so attacking all of our cultural spaces, political organizing, but at the same time, impoverishment, violence by the police. In the past few years, there have been massive increase of violence within the Palestinian community that is basically stemming from the structural violence, the broader structural violence that we live in. The Israeli state pursues the policies of impoverishment of Palestinian communities. In Palestine 48, it has allowed the proliferation and presence of weapons in the community. So it has facilitated the community's social fragmentation and political fragmentation for its own political ends. And I think what's important about what's happening today is the Palestinians regaining the sense of the collective, of each experiencing their life in a very different way, because that's what a settler colonial project is about. It's about fragmenting the Palestinian people politically, socially, and socially. And when you fragment a people socially, you're trying to disconnect them from each other. And that's what Israel has been pursuing for over 7 decades. And I think what we see today is Palestinian really obviously clearly saying that those policies have absolutely failed, no matter what are the grievances that each kind of section of the Palestinian people faces, be it the Palestinians in the West Bank against the PA, be it in 48 against kind of the state and police violence, be it in Gaza when it's bombarded and people are being killed en masse there, be it the attacks on Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem. Those manifest themselves in a different way, but at the moment, Palestinians are saying that your project to fragment us as a people and to weaken our collective political will has absolutely failed. So people are coming together, ignited by what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Jerusalem, but actually there's a lot here, and the framing is much bigger of what people are struggling around. So in Palestine 48, there's about 30 demos happening every day. Many of them are come in direct clashes with the Israeli apparatus. Huge amount of people being arrested, but also a very impressive sense of collective solidarity and collective work, with teams of lawyers coming together to defend people, with communities defending each other, and so on. And the target is very clear. It is the Israeli state and its institutions, and it's the Israeli police that repress Palestinians on a regular basis. And you see everybody on the streets. You see young, you see old, you see queer, you see women, you see people that you know, and many people that you don't know. And they are time and time again coming out on the street. And every time they come on the street, they face the repression of the Israeli state apparatus. So that's kind of the reality now, and of course the situation at the moment is the most tense situation at the moment.
Riya, you've mentioned the repression which is coming from the police. What specifically does a state of emergency mean in this context, if that's been declared in a town where protests are happening?
Well, a state of emergency means curfew. For those who don't know, Palestinians in Palestine 48 lived under Israeli military curfew from 1948 until 1966. This is the first time that a military curfew is being declared since then on a city within Palestine 48. What this has also meant is because Israel has declared its inability to control the city because of the magnitude of resistance in that city, it has called upon military services, the military to come. Some military units to come from the West Bank and to enter into the city. So a complete lockdown and a state of emergency also gives those forces the ability to go into homes, the ability to arrest. It's kind of it's become a military state where you have the military within your own state conducting your agenda on the street. So it's going to be very tough for people in Lid. Lid witnessed also the first martyr who was shot by a settler. And I think at the moment it's important to understand that Palestinian 48 are not only resisting the Israeli state police and its security services, but also heavily armed settlers that are roaming the streets looking for Palestinians to beat them up. At the moment in Lid, there's hundreds of settlers going around beating people. They actually entered the place where mourners were mourning the martyr who was killed and was shooting in the area. At the moment in the street, people in Lid are calling for the defense of the main Lid mosque because it's being under attack. So they're not only facing kind of state institutions, but actually you're coming to, it's becoming evidently clear how the whole of the Israeli society is a militarized society. So whether you're in uniform or out of uniform, you are a military agent at the end of the day, and that's what Palestinians are facing in Lid. And maybe just a comment on the flag. Maybe if it's a clip that is coming next. It's raising the Palestinian flag for Palestinian 48ers is not it's not secondary. It is a very important political act for identifying and defying Israel's attempt to break Palestinians 48ers from the larger Palestinian body politic. They're saying very defiantly, very clearly, no, we are Palestinians. We will not be Israelis, as you have really tried to make us since 1948. But also it's illegal to carry the Palestinian flag in Palestine 48. So anybody carrying the Palestinian flag is facing, risking it and facing arrest. And so the raising the flag, it's a massive act of defiance, both on kind of a personal level of risk, but also of defiance of clearly stating your belonging to something much bigger and your resistance to the current states, the structures that exist at the moment.
I should probably clarify for our audience, by Palestine 48, you mean all of Palestine within the 1948 borders of Israel, so what's normally called Israel. We do have that clip of that protest in Lid now that I think we can show you. And I mean, we can speak about the bombardment in a moment. First of all, I just want to show a short part of a discussion I had with Aya Al-Ghazawi earlier today, who is a resident in Gaza.
Because, every time we were trying to sleep, there is that huge and massive bombardment and airstrikes. We haven't slept for 2 days. We are extremely exhausted. and we don't know what to do. Also, we have frequent electricity blackouts. We are in a state of terror. We are traumatized. And this actually brings back to the scene what happened in Gaza back in 2008, 2012, 2014, when Israel also waged its war aggression against civilians in Gaza. I myself lost my cousin in 2008, and it brings back all these scenes of blood, all these scenes of bitterness. Gaza actually is facing a very grave and very serious, very dangerous situation. We don't know what to do. We don't have refuges. We are out in the open. We only have our homes. And Israel targets even residential buildings. Just yesterday, targeted more than 4 residential towers. One of them is Hanadi Tower, which is a 13-story building. 80 Palestinian families are displaced and homeless now, live in the street. So what actually Gaza is facing is a mix of genocide, a mix of that intermittent siege also, as we have been living under a medieval siege that Israel imposed on us for more than 15 years now. Why is the world still silent? And why is this allowed to happen? Why our children are deemed to die and to be killed by a heartless and hegemonic Israeli regime?
That was Aya Al-Ghazawi speaking to us from Gaza. Riya, I want to bring you in on the topic of these bombardments. Where do you see this going? I mean, obviously, Aya spoke there about it reminding her of the 2014 war. Do you see that as where this is going, a sort of full-blown war with just constant airstrikes and ultimately hundreds and thousands of people being injured and the sort of fatalities and death toll we saw in those previous operations?
Well, I have no doubt that Israel is trying to inflict the most harm on the people of Gaza, and there have been many martyrs. Gaza has witnessed many. Gaza has been under siege since 2007. Life in Gaza is, is horrendous for many people living in Gaza. They've witnessed many wars that all of us can remember. We're not even, and it is very much it's on the table. It's a card on the table. But I think it's important to remember and to acknowledge that the context at the moment is very different than 2014. The context at the moment is that Israel is resisting Palestinians everywhere. It is the whole of Palestine 48 is engulfed. The context at the moment is that Gaza is not the only place that is being attacked and being bombarded, and it's not only the people of Gaza that are enduring that violence this time. There's a movement. People are moving in Jerusalem. People are moving all over, and I think the stronger those movements become, it is our way to protect Gaza. That is the only way to protect Gaza from this side, from this end of where I'm sitting. It's the only way. It's the only way to do that. We have to keep going forward. We have to keep resisting. We have to keep building. And Israel has to face us everywhere. We can't leave Gaza alone. And I think this context changes the game a little bit. Although, of course, Israel is a murderous military state, a settler colonial state that has the ability to inflict a huge amount of harm on Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere. And it has to be a collective effort to make sure that doesn't happen, and there has to be a role for the international community as well in making sure that doesn't happen. There has to be a way of putting much more pressure, international global pressure, on Israel, and there's a role for the international community to play here for sure. But I think it's important also to recognize the different local contexts, and I think it's important to also recognize and remember that we are at the moment in a region engulfed by counter-revolutionary processes. And it's also important to remember the centrality of Palestine for movements and people in the region. And so it's not very clear whether it's going to be a straightforward 2014, 2008 scenario. I think the context is very different, and it can be different if we act to make it different.
Riya Al-Sana, thank you so much for your time and speaking to us this evening. I can see lots of people sending their solidarity in the comments. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Let's go to some of those comments. AAJ with a £50 donation, which is very generous. Thank you very much. I can't really watch tonight as it's difficult to not get angry or depressed at what's going on. But thanks for covering this fairly, Novara Media, and solidarity with Palestinians. And Zaina Sawafta with £20. As a British Palestinian, I am proud of this channel for covering this when many are reluctant to. I don't know how anyone can justify this degree of violence in this heavily unbalanced conflict. I know it is difficult to comprehend how people can justify this degree of violence. It's partly because of the way this is covered. It's covered as a cycle of violence, just this tragic event. One thing leads to another. How do you break the chain, which completely hides and elides the way that this is actually, it's not a particularly unstable situation. It's a very stable situation of ongoing dispossession where one side has all the power. That's what we're going to talk about in one moment in this next section. Israel's occupation of the West Bank, the deadly airstrikes it rains on Gaza, and the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes are not just the wrongdoings of one side in an equal conflict. They are rather the ongoing practices of settler colonialism. This is not a dispute, it's an occupation. So why do Western media outlets report on the aggressions of the Israeli government as if they are responses to provocations on the part of the people they occupy? There's a simple answer. It's the ideology of imperialism, but it's increasingly being called out. This was the Palestinian ambassador speaking to Newsnight's Emily Maitlis after 20 Palestinians, including 9 children, were killed in Israeli airstrikes on Monday in Gaza.
The Israelis think that Hamas are a radical terror group and that Palestinian officials use these holy times to incite violence. Was Hamas right to respond with rocket fire?
This isn't about Hamas. Hamas was not involved. There were tens of thousands.
They were when they fired rockets.
Hamas did not decide to evict people from their homes inside the occupied city of Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is occupied not according to my law only, but according to your law, according to the UK position, according to the United Nations. An occupation has to be temporary and it has to respect the rules that govern occupation. Israel has made mockery of these rules, particularly the issue of population transfers, ethnic cleansing, apartheid. I'm sure you have read the Human Rights Report. Those people have researched Israeli policies over the last 2 years. Ask the experts, not Netanyahu. Netanyahu is flaming
of the settlements, but let's just try and understand this. Because Dori Gold, the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, has told us it was pre-planned by Hamas. The march had nothing to do with it. You wanted to make Israel look bad. Do you condemn the rocket attacks by Hamas?
I condemn, and I condemn Israeli aggression. I mourn for the 20 people who were murdered in Gaza only tonight. 9 of them are children. I am so sad to see the hundreds of my people
but you know, so I'm not asking about Israeli aggression. I will do that in a moment. I'm asking you about Hamas's aggression tonight.
I am not aware of any Israeli who has been killed. And you ask me a question about violence and condemnation. Who should be condemned, Emily? Who should be condemned? Did you see the images of the 9 children being dissipated in Gaza tonight? Who should be condemned? And then the UK Foreign Secretary is quick to condemn Hamas and never to condemn the Israeli atrocities on a daily basis. We are sick and tired of the double standards, and we have to call it right this time. Call a spade a spade.
Is it the Western governments? Is it? You heard the statement from Dominic Raab today. He condemned the firing of rockets. What is your response to the UK government?
Always the story begins when Palestinian reaction happens, as if it started with Hamas. Look at your question. Your question is about Hamas, rockets.
But that's because I'm talking to you.
No, Emily. I have done many interviews. It starts with the Palestinian reaction, with the symptom of the illness. It never visits the illness. The illness is that this state, Israel, the occupying state, has been applying draconian measures against our people in every sense, depriving them the right to move, the right to own their property, the right to work, the right to vote in free elections, including in East Jerusalem, every right you can imagine, and not only by the way inside the occupied territories, but even inside Israel itself. There is a Knesset law that has deprived our people inside Israel their basic rights of having self-determination. This whole system has been built. Endemic in it is the racism, endemic in it is the vulgar ultra-nationalism. That's why you get people trying to defend their dignity.
Now, I mean, I think the key line there was really, really, really impressive response there to Emily Maitlis. I mean, really, really calm, composed under pressure. And I think what he said there that really struck with me is this idea. He said, it's always the story begins with the Palestinian reaction, the symptom of the illness. So we say, why are you beginning this conversation with rockets from Gaza when that completely just ignores the context that's happening here, which is this is a place which has been under siege. These are people defending themselves. I want to get up a tweet from Omar Badar, which I think, just really summarized this really, really well. It made a lot of sense to me, made a lot of sense of what we're witnessing right now to me. So he says, 1, status quo, occupation, apartheid is violence against Palestinians. 2, then Israel escalates through evictions, beatings, shootings. 3, then some Palestinians respond with violence. And then 4, then Israel responds with massacres. If you start reporting at number 3, you're misleading your audience. And clearly that's where that interview was starting with. That interview was starting with, were Hamas justified in sending rockets? It's ignored the status quo, which is occupation and apartheid, and it's ignored the Israeli escalations which preceded those rockets being fired. But still, Western media always starts with the rockets. So that makes it seem like, oh, it's just these two sides. It's this cycle of violence. Ash, I want to get your thoughts on this because, I mean, as Emily Maitlis said there, she sort of suggested, look, I'm going to now give some tough questions to the Israeli ambassador. I actually watched the show. She does ask some tough questions, but none of them go into the issue of apartheid or occupation. They're all about, oh, maybe you're not responsible enough with your power. Maybe you're too trigger happy. None of them were really looking at the disease, which is occupation and which is apartheid. And how do you think the media get away with it? Why do they do it? Why do they frame this as an equal battle between two sides?
I think that in order to address this question, one of the things that you've got to do is look at the ideology which is underpinning this entire discussion. Now, you correctly called it imperialism, but another word that you could give it is essentially a liberal outlook on international relations. So you can acknowledge that something is a conflict. You can even sometimes acknowledge that something is an asymmetric conflict where one side has got access to greater weaponry and technology than the other side. But what you cannot do and what you cannot get your own head around is the way in which even liberal states are complicit and active parts in ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism, because that is the narrative and the historical frame which makes all of this make sense, which makes that number 1, day-to-day apartheid and dispossession, number 2, escalation of aggression, number 3, response of violence, number 4, response of massacres. That is the frame which makes all of those things make sense. And liberal media, and when I'm saying liberal, I'm not talking here in terms of, social democratic or what do you think about wealth redistribution. I'm talking about, in some ways that much looser ideological universe. Liberal media cannot make sense of this. It will not make sense of this, because then you have to ask the question of why. What was Britain's involvement in this? What was America's involvement in this? And how much do we put into maintaining a system of slow and then sometimes accelerated ethnic cleansing, where the day-to-day status quo of that system is apartheid? We do not have a media which is capable of addressing those questions. And as such, the humanity of Palestinians, and when I say humanity, I'm not just talking simply in terms of personhood. I'm talking humanity, the culture, the human rights, the right to self-defense, to resistance and self-determination. All of these things get pulled through what is essentially a war on terror frame. So it presumes that these people, most of whom are Muslim, are essentially terrorist or terrorist adjacent. It delegitimizes acts of lawful resistance and lawful self-defense against an occupying and out of control military force, and presents these things as terrorist and racialized threats, which have got a particular salience within an ecology of images within a British and an American context. And so that's why you see there is this uphill battle when there are Palestinians making media interventions. Now, the Palestinian ambassador in Newsnight made a very forthright and a very compelling and a very convincing one. What's important, I think, is for all of us with what little comparative platform we have, compared to Emily Maitlis or Newsnight, is to talk about that framing which makes sense of what's going on and not fall into this delusion that what we're seeing is an equal-sided conflict in which both sides are equally to blame, and if everyone just sat down, have a cup of tea, it would all be solved. No.
You see these really banal tweets. I saw one today. I'm not precisely sure. I'm pretty sure it's David Aronovich at the Times, and he was saying, both the Israeli governments and Hamas, they're not working in the interests of their citizens. They're not the ones who are going to get bombed. It's a bit, and it's just this sort of super banal, that the leaders are all irrational, and it's this cycle of violence. And it just, as you say, Ash, it doesn't make sense of what's going on because you're not looking at the real context. You're not looking at the real explanation. That was one example of a Palestinian really impressively calling out a host who was, I suppose, giving this misleading framing of what's currently going on in Palestine. Another one is, or another clip that this one really went viral, was from Mohammed El-Kurd, a journalist whose family are at threat of expulsion from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Here he is speaking to CNN.
Do you support the protests, the violent protests that have erupted, in solidarity with you and other families in your position right now?
Do you support the violent dispossession of me and my family?
I'm just asking if you support the protests that are taking place in support of your family.
I support popular protests taking place against ethnic cleansing, yes.
Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Mohammed El-Kurd, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was such a powerful answer, because this whole idea, do you condemn the odd act of violence, or systematic violence? Who knows? It's essentially saying, do you condemn resistance to apartheid? Is essentially what the question she's asking, and it is a ridiculous question, and it should be called out as a ridiculous question. If what's going on is settler colonialism and apartheid, then for us to just constantly moralize about the tactics used by the oppressed, it's a distraction, essentially. This bias that you've just seen from these hosts is also reflected in policy. Absolutely reflected in policy, in fact. This was UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab's response on Monday night after 20 Palestinians, including 9 children, had been killed by airstrikes in Gaza. Raab tweeted, "The UK condemns the firing of rockets at Jerusalem and locations within Israel. The ongoing violence in Jerusalem and Gaza must stop. We need an immediate de-escalation on all sides and end to targeting of civilian populations." So that is just so duplicitous. The UK condemns the firing of rockets at Jerusalem and locations within Israel. That's the only thing he tweeted. There'd been 20 Palestinians killed. At that point in time, there'd been no Israeli killed. And he thinks that's a reasonable response. How more obvious could it be that you don't value Palestinian lives? Ash, I want to get your commentary on that tweet from Dominic Raab and that clip we just saw on CNN.
Dealing with the Dominic Raab tweet first, there was a statement from an IDF spokesperson, which I think came out today. And what it said was there is one address in Gaza. It is called Hamas. So if you want to talk about targeting of civilian populations, the entire nature of what's going on in Gaza, the fact that it is essentially an open air prison where most of the water isn't even drinkable, where there's, incredible levels of deprivation and unemployment. And that is what it is like during peacetime. It is made that way. It is allowed to be that way because the West maintains and shares in this delusion that the entirety of Gaza must be considered a legitimate terrorist target. Now, that is not something which is legal under international law. There are rules in terms of armed conflict, in terms of distinction and proportionality, and even during so-called peacetime, even during times where there is not, the active bombardment of residential buildings, these rules of disproportionality and distinction are not respected. That's why it exists as an open-air prison in the first place. So talking about the targeting of civilians, as if there is any equality between the firing of rockets, most of which are caught and destroyed by the Israeli Iron Dome system, and what goes on in Gaza on a day-to-day basis is at best delusional and at worst actively complicit in racism, imperialism, and ethnic cleansing. And as for the CNN clip, again, another wonderfully strong intervention, because it's a silly question. It's a fundamentally silly question, because what you never hear, and what you never hear put to spokespeople for the IDF or to the Israeli government is, well, what would you consider a proportionate response be to the ethnic cleansing of your people? Because then we can get away from this discourse, and it is a nonsense discourse which treats all acts of violence the same. Of course, in an ideal world, we think that all acts of violence should be considered with equal moral weight and equal political meaning. But we do not live in that world, and we do not live in that world because there is an uneven distribution of violence in the world. So in the face of your oppression, your dispossession, your bombardment and your arrest and your obliteration as a culture, what do you think is a reasonable means by which to express dissent and to resist that ongoing process? Now, that is, of course, an open political question. Where people draw the line is different, but it is, in fact, a political question and not simply a moral one, which means that you can look at what's going on, not just in Gaza, but across the occupied territories, and issue a blanket condemnation, which is in effect a blank check for the ongoing abuse of power and ethnic cleansing perpetrated by the Israeli state and settlers.
That's so well put, Ash. That idea that no one has ever asked what would be a reasonable response to ethnic cleansing. So you're absolutely right. That will never be asked. In terms of, I mean, we've just been talking about how it's ridiculous to see all violence as the same, because one side here is being occupied and one side is the occupier. In fact, though, most of the mainstream media and the big Western powers, they do the opposite. Basically, any violence by the occupier is legitimate, and any violence by the occupied isn't. So it's completely looking through the looking glass. And the best example of this was from this week. It was a response of Joe Biden's spokesperson on the Middle East to the airstrikes and the rockets we're currently seeing.
We're speaking of the principle of self-defense.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred, but the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by on behalf of Israel and every other country.
Do you think that an Israeli military response to the rockets coming in, a military response to the rockets coming in is covered by this broader rubric of self-defense, right?
Self-defense often does authorize the use of force.
Thank you, Matt. I want to ask you about East Jerusalem, but let's talk about what you said about the principle of self-defense. Does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
In broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask you on Israel. I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Okay.
You're going to know as soon as I read what your answer was that there's a big problem with it. You said, well, not a problem, it just doesn't answer the question. We believe that it, meaning the right to self-defense, applies to any state. Well, you see the problem, right? Yes?
Do you want to?
Do you regard Palestine as a state?
I wasn't
referring. Do you think that? You don't in the context of the ICC and the UN. So are you saying that you do not? If it applies to any state, are you saying that Palestinians don't have a right to self-defense?
I was making a broader point, not attached to Israel or the Palestinians in that case.
So they do have a right to self-defense.
Matt, I'm not in a position to debate the legalities from up here. What our message is one of de-escalation.
That was just disgusting to watch, actually, essentially. He's saying when Israel bombs Gaza, when Israel bombs Palestinians, that's self-defense. States have a right to self-defense. If they feel like they're at risk from rockets which are being fired, then they have a right to respond, essentially however they want. If they bomb tower blocks, so be it. That's the right to self-defense. He's saying, but the Palestinians, you see, they don't have a state. So they don't have the right to self-defense. All they have is terrorism. And so you can see this way whereby he has basically automatically legitimized the violence of the oppressor and automatically delegitimized the violence of the oppressed. That's why I say it's through the looking glass. It is, the precise opposite of what any moral compass should tell you in this situation. As Ash says, you can have legitimate debates about how oppression should be resisted, right? So there will be people that say, even if a people are colonized and oppressed, I'm not comfortable with them using violence. It's a fine position. But to say the oppressor can use violence, the oppressed cannot, and to almost have these sort of rules, which means that's by definition the case, it's just phenomenally disgusting, really. Ash, I want to bring you in on this because this isn't the Trump administration. This is the Biden administration. And we know that, on certain issues, when it comes to, fiscal policy, for example, they have been fairly progressive. And Biden is seen to be a president who does, listen to the left. But when it comes to foreign policy and policy on things like Palestine, it's hard to imagine a response that's more reactionary than that, really, isn't it?
Look, when it comes to America thinking that the security interests of Israel are in line with American geopolitical interests, this is, of course, something which extends for a much longer durée than the appearance of Trump. And it is truly, I think, an issue of bipartisan agreement. This is sometimes quite crudely, I think, understood as the power of the Israel lobby, but it's actually something which I think, you can understand through the power of America in the region of the Middle East and seeing Israel as a vehicle for the advancement of American and more generally Western interests in the region. And so that's why I think you do not have a serious tilt leftwards from Joe Biden or his spokesperson, although you may see perhaps much less flagrant support for the expansion and the activities of Netanyahu, and you might have a bit more considered or muted condemnation than you certainly would have had under Trump. But when it comes to the fundamentals about the recognition of a Palestinian state, the recognition of a Palestinian state and people's right to self-determination, to resistance, to self-defense, you are not going to see something which is all that different from what a Republican president or indeed what President Trump would say.
In terms of people who pose as being progressive but are actually very reactionary when it comes to issues like this, I've just got one more example for you. This is Wes Streeting, just been promoted to the shadow cabinet, it's worth noting. He tweeted last night, "There can be no justification for the Hamas rockets raining down on Israel tonight. Friends of mine are cowering in shelters with their children." And he goes on, don't even bother with what about tweets. I wrote to the Foreign Secretary today about the loss of life in Gaza and related issues. I deplore those rocket attacks too. Some might treat this conflict like cheering on a football team. I don't. Try being consistent yourselves. Now, I mean, the first tweet there is what Ash was saying. He's flattening violence to just completely decontextualize it. Violence when you are resisting occupation and apartheid is the same as violence when you are trying to enforce occupation and apartheid, according to Wes Streeting in that tweet. And secondly, that second one, to say, if you see a difference between fighting apartheid and enforcing apartheid, that's essentially the same as supporting a football team. That he is willing to belittle this issue to such an extent that he thinks that anyone who seriously cares about apartheid and colonialism and occupation is just doing this because it's like a game to them. And I mean, I'm sorry, Wes Streeting, but this isn't a game, right? And it's not a game to the people who care about it. The people who care about it because they have a moral conscience, and they hate to see overwhelming force used to oppress a people for over 50 years while they kill children in airstrikes. And if you can't empathize with that, if you can't relate to that, if you think that must be cynical, then the problem is with your moral compass, not with anyone else's. It makes my skin crawl, to be frank. Ash, I want you to interject. I want you to take over on the Wes Streeting issue from me.
I mean, you know what? What Wes Streeting said is so intellectually derelict, I'm not going to respond to it directly because it is so farcical. I'm sorry. But what I do want to speak to is perhaps a wider audience which is wrestling with this political question about the nature of resistance. Is violence ever justified, and so on and so forth? Of course, people are going to have different points of view on this. And one of the things that I would like to draw attention to is something that Arundhati Roy wrote, which is that you can only go on hunger strike if you're not already hungry. And so certain acts of symbolic nonviolence, where what you do is you display your vulnerability to the world, well, you need an audience, number one, and number two, you already need a recognition of your humanity. So if you don't have these things, what use is the spectacle of nonviolence in the face of violence? You might think that it means that you do have a certain moral integrity and it's always there, but in terms of effectiveness, in terms of survival, in terms of being able to actively resist your own ethnic cleansing and your own cultural obliteration and your own oppression by an apartheid system, well, no, it doesn't also do those things. And this is something which the left in this country, and when I'm talking about the left, I'm not just talking about the so-called hard left, I'm also talking about the social democratic left, the soft left. This was something which they understood perfectly well when it came to the struggle against South African apartheid. Now, Nelson Mandela is often remembered as akin to Gandhi. He kind of fits in the same frame. Of course, he was leader of the armed wing of the ANC for quite some time. And during this time period, there was a sense that in order to support resistance of South African apartheid, there was a range of activities which were appropriate for an international community standing in solidarity. For instance, a boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which was advanced by many people here in the UK. And there was also a sense that in the face of the daily brutality of apartheid, that you couldn't apply the same moral compass as you would for a liberal democracy which has some recognition of civil rights, democratic rights, and shared humanity, that you cannot apply the same moral standards in terms of resistance and political activity. And I think that whatever side you come down on this question of political violence, specifically with regards to Palestine, that is the frame of mind that you need to be in. You need to be thinking critically, and you need to think about just what it is your demand for performative acts of nonviolence is really about. And is it fundamentally about trying to appease your own sense of having internalized this narrative about Palestinians as being war on terror adjacent, of being, kind of inherently terroristic and having to demonstrate their own amenability to liberal values before you recognize their humanity? I think that's something that's worth thinking about for the left. And that's something which I think is much more worth commenting on than, frankly, idiotic tweets by Wes Streeting.
I apologise sincerely for subjecting you to Wes Streeting's tweets. I know you try very hard to avoid those in your daily life. Let's go to a comment. Paul Taylor with a tenner. Thank you very much. Thanks, Novara, the only sane voice out there. Donated in memory of Del Singh, a schoolmate and a much missed advocate for the Palestinians. We really appreciate that message and that, I suppose, that tribute to Del Singh. If you are enjoying the show, please do give us a like. It helps us in the algorithm. It's been a bad week for Labour and Keir Starmer when it comes to election results and polls. In last week's local election, Labour lost 326 council seats, while the Conservatives gained 235. Labour also lost a considerable number of seats to the Greens. You can see they added 88 councillors to the number they already had. Now, the results were the worst showing for a leader of the opposition in their first round of local elections in over 40 years. So here you can see that in those elections, the ones that just happened, Labour lost 7% of their councillors. Now, we've got the data from 1984 of the seats lost or gained by leaders of the opposition in the first local elections of their leadership. And no one has done this badly. Jeremy Corbyn lost seats in the first election as his leader of the opposition, which was historically quite poor. Keir Starmer, much poorer, much worse. Ed Miliband increased Labour's councillors by 9% in his first set of council elections. As you can see, Tony Blair did quite well in 1995. As well. So all of this shows us when it comes to electoral performances, Labour under Keir Starmer is looking historically bad. But what about Keir Starmer himself? Now, the argument you'll often hear from Labour's centrists is that Keir Starmer is actually fairly popular. Labour are just struggling because they have a tarnished brand. Well, unfortunately for Sir Keir, that claim is not borne out in polling data. And in the wake of last week's council results, his personal ratings have continued to go south. How do we know this? YouGov regularly asks voters the following question. Do you think Keir Starmer is doing well or badly as leader of the Labour Party? Now, in their latest survey from the 10th of May, just 17% said he was doing well, which is down 9 points since April the 12th. In that same survey, 65% said he was doing badly, which is up a huge 15 points from April 12th. That gives Starmer a net approval rating of -48, his worst ever with YouGov. -48, that's pretty bad. Now, how does this compare with the historically unpopular, the unelectable, the disastrous Jeremy Corbyn? Well, if we compare like with like, so that's their ratings at the same point in their leadership, it turns out that Starmer comes out worse. So this is the ratings that Corbyn had in September 2016. Again, not very good. 21% of people thought he was doing well. 61% of people thought he was doing badly. Not good. Those are bad ratings. They needed improving. Keir Starmer, though, it's worse. So only 17% of people think he's doing well at his job. 65% think he's doing badly. So this is the man who was elected to be leader of the Labour Party precisely because he would be better at the media. He'd be better at communicating to the public. He'd be more confident, competent, and popular. And it turns out he's doing worse than Corbyn. And when it comes to public opinion, obviously Corbyn had some achievements to put to his name, even when he was, quite unpopular. He, brought new ideas back into the mainstream. What has Keir Starmer achieved other than people not really liking him? Now, Ash, I want to bring you in on this because on one level, I'm quite impressed with Keir Starmer. And that's because I seriously didn't believe you could end up with ratings quite this bad without a systematic smear campaign against you. Keir Starmer has done this all of his own accord. He didn't have any help in becoming this unpopular. It was just him.
Do you know what? I think all of us were guilty of vastly overestimating Keir Starmer's competence because it was a creature of pure aesthetics. He was a man who came along, said, I am competent. And we all went, Yeah, that sounds like the kind of thing a competent person would say. It was something that was reinforced, of course, by his main cheerleaders, his team, and lobby journalists. Everybody absolutely raced to fall over themselves, calling him forensic and, just this image of professionalism and electability. And then the problem is that he turned out to be not particularly electable because people won't vote for him, and not particularly professional because he keeps doing things badly. And so when that's your offer to people, and it's not really based on values, it's not really based on an attractive political culture, and it's certainly not based on a policy vision about how you're going to improve this country, once those things melt away, what are you left with? You're left with somebody who looks a bit tetchy, who comes across like a deputy head teacher who's just lost control of the school assembly. And what's more, everybody can see it. And that's the problem, I think, of having a Labour leadership which goes, we can win things, is when you don't. And when you don't, because I think there is this historic material realignment in English politics, and you don't have anything to speak to those chasms in terms of home ownership and values and concentrations of young voters, then you just look like a stuffed suit. You've got nothing for you. So in a way, yeah, I'm impressed by how fast it's fallen apart for him. I don't think that there's been any other Labour leader who's fallen so far, not only in the public estimation so quickly, but has also hemorrhaged the support that he was able to count on amongst Britain's commentariat. And the sad thing for him is that he doesn't have this lively, passionate grassroots movement to back him up, because he spent the last year of his leadership going, I'm embarrassed of you. You're too woke, you're too urban, and those of you who voted for my predecessor are probably all anti-Semites. Now, that means that you don't have this really vibrant movement to ride into the rescue and do all the stuff that you can't achieve through media interventions anymore. So what's he done? He's alienated his left flank, traipsing right after a bunch of votes who aren't ever going to come back, and taking advice from Labour right-wingers who, the minute it's convenient to them, are going to throw him out a window. That's hardly forensic now, is it?
It's hardly forensic. I have to say, I am just really, because Corbyn, by September 2016, he'd been completely dragged through the mud. Terrorist sympathiser, anti-Semite, hates Britain. All of these things have been printed about Jeremy Corbyn to create a level of hostility among the public towards him, right? And obviously, also, the first months of Corbyn were a mess, right? His team was a mess. They didn't know what they were doing, right? So for Starmer to be doing even worse than that, we've talked about why the Corbyn campaign originally was a bit of a mess. It's because he never expected to be in power. He was constantly subjected to attempts to overthrow him. Keir Starmer has had lots of things in his favor, right? He had a big team of people who had done this before. Peter Mandelson he's brought in. He knows how to lead a party. Got terrible politics, but he knows what he's doing. They're not completely new to all of this. And the press have gone really, really lightly on them. And they're doing even worse than Jeremy Corbyn. If someone had said that in the leadership election, you'd get called like a deluded ultra-leftist. To assume that Keir Starmer would be less popular than Jeremy Corbyn, I think people would say, what the hell are you talking about? You could say, his politics aren't as exciting, but he's clearly going to be more popular than Jeremy Corbyn. At the same point in their leadership, no. It wasn't just this poll by YouGov either. The first poll to be released after the local elections was by Redfield and Winton Strategies. They say Keir Starmer's net approval rating stands at -7%, a 6-point decrease from last week, and the lowest ever net approval rating for Starmer since he became leader of the Labour Party. Now, obviously, they use a slightly different method to YouGov, or ask a slightly different question, which means that their approval ratings, while still low, are not as low as YouGov had them for. I'm not sure the precise comparison with Corbyn there. I think that's a new company, so they probably didn't have him then. In that same poll, we can see the effect the local elections and the fallout from them had on voting intention. So this is the latest from Redfield Winton. The Conservatives are up 5 on 45%. Labour are down 4 on 34%. This often happens after elections. People think, the Conservatives are winners. Maybe we should vote for them. The Labour Party, they're losers. Why would we vote for them? you'll remember, after the 2017 general election, that's when Labour's polling was super, super high because people were like, oh, actually, this party's serious. Other people like them will pile in. So, yeah, I mean, interesting. I wonder if he'll be able to come back from these terrible ratings for a little bit more of a granular sense of what people think about Keir Starmer, especially when compared to Boris Johnson. We can go to more details from Redfield and Winton. So they asked voters or respondents, who do you think best embodies the following characteristics? And they included: stands up for the interests of the United Kingdom, can build a strong economy, is a strong leader, can work with foreign leaders, understands the problems affecting the UK, represents change, has better foreign policy strategy, tells the truth, and cares about people like me. So there's lots of these, and you can see them all up on the screen. There's only one in which Keir Starmer comes out ahead of Boris Johnson, and that's that he is in better good physical and mental health than Boris Johnson, according to the public. And you've got to remember, a year ago, Boris Johnson was taken into an intensive care unit with coronavirus. So to be in better physical and mental health than Boris Johnson isn't particularly hard. It's also not much of a political achievement, is it, to be in better health than your opponent. Ash, your final thoughts on this particular topic. Is there any way Keir can make a comeback?
I mean, political turnarounds work when a politician is able to say, I wasn't being myself before, but now I am. Here is my real self. Now, the problem with Keir Starmer is that really, since the time he's become an MP, he hasn't really had a real self that you get a sense of, or that you think he's abandoned. So if you're trying to go, and this is the real authentic me, and it will manifest in these values and these policies and this way of relating to the world around me, I don't think it works. And I think the problem is that he jettisoned having his own analysis of how the world works and what the Labour Party should do in favour of these completely empty aesthetic signifiers of electability and professionalism. And now with those two things in tatters, I think he's got nothing left. So he might completely surprise me. He might reach down deep and find a real authentic self that was lurking there the whole time, all these policies that he really believes in, and a cultural frame which holds it all together. But I just don't think he's got it in him.
Let's go straight on to our next story after just a couple of comments. Gerard McKeown, I think, with 4.99. Apologies for that. Solidarity to the Ballymurphy families who received a measure of truth yesterday. A public apology is due. So the Ballymurphy deaths, if you weren't aware, there are a series of incidents between the 9th and 11th of August 1971 in which the British Army killed 9 civilians in Ballymurphy, Northern Ireland. Now, they've been subject to an injustice for decades. Whilst we've been on air following I think it was a legal ruling, Boris Johnson has apologised, and I quote, unreservedly on behalf of the UK government over the Ballymurphy deaths. And I quote, the huge anguish caused. So one of those situations where some justice comes, but people have to wait 50 years for it. In a sign that all is well and good in Britain's mainstream media, on Wednesday morning, ITV viewers were able to enjoy their breakfast alongside 2 noted war criminals. Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair, the 2 key architects of a war that destroyed a region, discussed whether Labour would ever re-enter power. Let's take a look.
Do you think it's possible that you are the last Labour politician to become elected as Prime Minister? It does feel a bit existential to me at the moment.
Well, it's a huge problem for Labour because we did something that the Labour Party's never done in its history before. I mean, if you go back in the 120 years of Labour's history, there are 3 occasions in which the far left have got near to the leadership of the Labour Party. 1935, 1983, 2019. All of them have been the worst defeats we've ever had. But only in the last defeat, 2019, did the far left actually capture the leadership of the party itself. And, look, you can agree with Jeremy Corbyn, don't agree with him, but it was a dramatic change in the type of Labour Party that had been put forward. And when you do something like that, you can't just recover easily.
No, so what does Keir do to recover?
You've got to spell out what is now different. It's not just a different leader, The question is, what's your vision for the country? You know, where do you stand as a Labour Party? Are you still with some of that far left agenda, or do you go to being, which is, in my view, the only way Labour ever wins, you're in the centre ground, you're a moderate, forward-looking political party, you're working with business as well as trade unions, personal responsibility as well as social responsibility. You know, where do you pitch your tent? What's the ground you're trying to hold?
Now, what really struck me about that particular interaction, other than that you can, you know, lie to the public about weapons of mass destruction, lead to the destruction of an entire region and then still end up hosting a TV show, or you can be the person who planned and executed an illegal war and end up being asked for sage advice when it comes to how your your successors can enter power. Was that this analysis hasn't changed in 25 years. So Tony Blair, I mean, he could have been, you know, carcinogenically, is that the word for it, frozen, and just woken up and he's asked the same question and he gives the same answer, which is, what you have to do to win is you have to go to the centre, you have to tell people that there's no left-wingers in the Labour Party and say we're going to work with both trade unions and business. I mean, it's such a banal thing to say. Ash, my question for you is that given all of these TV companies can save on cab fares by just playing clips of Tony Blair from the mid-1990s, why do they keep having him on?
Bro, the word you were looking for was cryogenically.
Cryogenically frozen.
Carcinogenically means relating to cancer.
Relating to cancer. You probably can't be carcinogenically frozen.
You probably can't, but I can see why your brain went there. Okay, so why do they keep turning to Tony Blair for another weekly rare intervention into politics? It's because the media is lazy, the media is politically incurious, and the media is also ideologically opposed to seeing the left do well. So if you wanted to have an honest kind of discussion about, well, what kind of party should Labour be? Of course, you would have a Blairite there. That is a significant part of Labour's recent political tradition. That's a relevant discussion to have. But you would also have a Milibandite, and you would also have at least one Corbynite, because those are the three most significant political figures of Labour's recent history. It's an open discussion, it's a debate, and then you could have, I think, some more trustworthy information than what Tony Blair was coming out with, and a bit of probing of some of the things he said. Because what's striking, he's casting himself as the only person who's, you know, added dramatically to Labour's vote share. Well, there was a little year called 2017 in which that also happened. And so that is a discussion. Regardless of whether you think that was due to Corbyn doing well or Theresa May doing badly, that is a discussion. And we're not going to see that debate happening. And it's a debate that the public deserves to hear, because who's doing the interviewing? Well, it's, you know, Tony Blair's old WMD, mate. You know, it's the 45-minute men back together, you know, to tour the country's community halls. That's why you're not getting a serious conversation. And the reason why the media turns to these people, again, it's laziness, it's political incuriosity, and it's a deep opposition to the left. And while I think there is a lot of public appetite for left-bashing narratives, particularly if you're thinking about a public appetite which is being driven by older, more socially conservative voters, you know, this is a narrative which they'll lap up. It doesn't mean that they're going to turn towards Alistair Campbell or Tony Blair as reliable sources of information or reliable sources of a political vision which is appealing, because these two men are still bywords for untrustworthiness, for lies, and for fundamental dishonesty in politics. So I think that is one of those things which is, in a way, it's harmful for both Keir Starmer and also the Labour Party, which is to the right of Keir Starmer, you know, your progress affiliated lot. Because this week, it's Blair and Mandelson who have been the most visible defenders and then occasional critics of Starmer on the airwaves. Where is he? He's nowhere. But it also means that when it comes to, you know, people who sit on the Labour right, who might be looking for a leadership bid, whether that's, you know, Rachel Reeves or Bridget Phillipson or even somebody like Yvette Cooper, you've got these people who most of the public think are slimy, are untrustworthy, are self-serving, representing your politics. And that's I think, a stupid political strategy. If I was a member of the Labour right, I'd be fuming that Tony Blair was the one going out to bat for my faction of the party.
The public are correct, by the way, when they think they're slimy, untrustworthy, and unsavory characters in mainstream politics. You mentioned there Peter Mandelson. He is the other person who is flying the flag of zombie centrism this week. He spoke to the New Statesman from his rented cottage in Wiltshire and told the magazine, this was of his trips to Hartlepool. I was struck going back onto all the old council estates where I used to draw so much support by what owner occupation and new private house building has done. There's a smartness and tidiness to those houses and their gardens. I can see people are proud of what they've achieved. They're aspirational, and they're not so sure now that they've achieved that with Labour. Now, this is really, I mean, you say he's making an argument that council homes are bad in 2021. And he also seems to believe that he is in tune with the electorate. Now, building new council houses is one of the most uncontroversially popular policies any government can adopt right now, which is why, even, if only in words, the Conservatives commit to building new council homes. Obviously, they're not building nowhere near enough, but they sort of castigate New Labour for not building enough council homes and say, we're going to build more than New Labour, right? Peter Mandelson still thinks that council homes are something which are unpopular. It's also ridiculous, this idea, if you privatize the council homes, which is essentially his implication, then people will have property, they can improve it themselves. This idea of self-improvement, which is, in the abstract is fine. That's not what you get by privatizing council homes. So in London, 42% of former council homes are now on the private rental market. So that doesn't create people who can make a nice, neat home that expresses themselves, right? Who can have pride in their front garden or whatever. All that creates is people who are paying much, much higher rent. So that's just more money out of local economies. It's more of our incomes and our wages going to people who aren't working for anything. And it creates this speculative bubble economy. Everything that was wrong with New Labour, he has not learnt a thing. As Ash said, he also talked about Keir Starmer, and not all of it was positive. This is what Peter Mandelson said. He knows a transformation is necessary, but he doesn't have the political project to match that transformation or the allies in the party to help him bring it about. He's realized changing the face at the top of the party and then giving one last heave isn't going to work, but there's no project in place to do more. There's no point in getting rid of the incubus of Jeremy Corbyn and continuing to uphold his policies and manifesto on which we went down to such a terrible defeat in 2019. Now, what interests me about the language used here is, I suppose, the extent to which he uses the language of transformation. He's saying he needs a political project of transformation. But all these people can talk about, be it Tony Blair or Peter Mandelson or Alistair Campbell, is they want to turn back the clock to a different kind of Labour Party. There's so little which is said about society at large, the changing economy. It's just he needs a more radical transformation to kick the left out of the Labour Party and make it like it was when we won in 1997. Like, that's his vision of radical transformation. There's nothing transformative about it. It's just a reversal to something which is now completely out of date. Peter Mandelson, Ash, depressingly, very, very, very influential in Labour right now. He seems to be, I mean, he said in this particular interview that he doesn't spend much time speaking to Keir Starmer. He said, in fact, he hasn't spoken to him for a few years, I think. Potentially it's not since 2019 or 2018. But we do know that he is giving advice to the leader's office. He's signing off on messaging strategies. He's very close to Morgan McSweeney, who's the chief of staff. So even if there's no personal one-to-one connections with Keir Starmer, he's still having massive influence over the operation and what's going on.
What's interesting is that some of the things he's bringing up, for instance, the lack of social housing, the presence of new builds and high rates of home ownership in otherwise very deprived areas which suffer from low wages and low investment in infrastructure, those are actually precisely the kinds of challenges that Labour are facing electorally. And that is part and parcel of this political shift that you're seeing in those so-called red wall seats, which has been amplified and accelerated through the kind of Brexit-related culture war. And the demographic changes that you're seeing in blue wall seats, the changes around Essex and, the fact that you've got council seats in Worthing and Falmouth going to Labour, that's happening much slower than the political consequences of those changes in class composition driven by home ownership in red wall seats. That's actually a pretty good diagnosis of the challenge that's facing Labour. What he's saying, we need a transformation. Well, a transformation how? Because these are people who have their economic needs being served fairly well by the Conservative Party, who've presided over asset price inflation. And also, I'm not saying this because people who own their homes and have paid off their mortgage are horrible, greedy people. It's also that these are people who tend to be older, who rely on the upward trajectory of their house prices to make sure that they can cover the costs of care in their old age as well. So there's a material interest that's in there, which isn't just, I want more money because, you know, I'm Scrooge McDuck. And that is a challenge for Labour, because obviously that is a kind of material interest which is directly in opposition to the interests of younger working age voters clustered around the cities who need house prices to come down, not simply so they can buy a house and get on the housing ladder, but also to bring down the cost and the price of renting. So this is the thing about Labour's fractured electoral coalition, is that it's often solely understood in cultural terms, but I think that some of that cultural divergence is a product of a material divergence of interests. So Peter Mandelson saying that, you know, this is the problem facing Labour, I go, yeah, great. When he says, well, what are we going to do about it? He goes, well, more of the long 90s, please. That's simply not possible, because you've got a cohort of older voters who are not coming back to you. They are simply not coming back to you because those nostalgic attachments to Labour, which are a kind of hangover from having, you know, militant trade unions, having had decent social housing provision, and also from having had the existence of, you know, an industrial base which holds people together in a context of work and geography. Those are things which have waned significantly over the last 40 years. Also, don't forget, the majority of young people under Margaret Thatcher voted for her. So what you're building on in terms of an older voter cohort is that block of young people who are quite happy to vote for Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. And so those you know, swings away from Labour, which are driven by these big contextual factors that I'm talking about, are building on something that was already there. In terms of where you go, you've got to think not so much about how do you traipse after the voters who are not going to come back, but how do you speak to and animate the ones that you've got in such a way that you can boost voter turnout, which was the only way in which you see the kind of result that you did in 2017. It wasn't a result of Tory to Labour switches. It was about Corbyn really geeing up and boosting turnout amongst low-income voters, first-time voters, and young voters. And if you don't do that, if you maintain this fiction that we can somehow be in the long 90s where nobody minds getting into loads and loads of debt, and nobody minds the fact that they're completely excluded from home ownership, and nobody minds that they're being crippled by high costs of living despite existing within the low-wage economy, Labour's not going to get anywhere. And when it comes to, well, what you really need to do is purge the left. Purge me, man. I've been sitting here watching the money go out my direct debit. Fine. I don't care. Purge me. But that's still not going to mean that you've got the ideas which are going to galvanize people in this country and have Labour form a government.
Our reaction to Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson and Keir Starmer blaming Jeremy Corbyn for Labour's electoral woes. But what about the man himself? Jeremy Corbyn spoke to ITV today. Let's take a look.
I'm big and grown up and don't particularly care what people say, but I think it's a bit rich to start blaming me for stuff that's been done over the past year that I've had absolutely no part of whatsoever. And I do think that dumping on somebody because they're not there anymore is a bit weak, really.
He seems in good spirits. Well, that was a very strong reaction. I'm a big man. I could take some criticism, but it's a little bit weak, isn't it? I mean, it is very, very weak. It's incoherent and it's weak. It doesn't make any sense to blame Corbyn that you've got worse ratings than Corbyn. Literally, there's no way you can possibly make that argument work. In voting, or sorry, in election results, you've gone backwards. In polling, you've gone backwards. You can't blame Jeremy Corbyn for that. We have a comment from Owen Jones. Owen Jones with £10. Good friend of the show. Thank you, Novara, for covering the reality of the Israeli oppression. I await the Labour Party leadership's sick forensic response. Yes, don't we all? Hopefully it is not crafted by Wes Streeting. Final story. We're going to run through this super quick, but it is an important one. Even once we escape the COVID-19 pandemic, there are multiple urgent challenges facing our government in Westminster. That includes regional inequality, climate change, a social care crisis, and the list goes on. However, in the Queen's speech, which is a chance for the government to put forward their legislative agenda for the coming year, the most headline-grabbing announcement has aimed to solve a problem which doesn't exist. Yes, Boris Johnson's government has confirmed it will be legislating to make photo ID a requirement for voting, even though only 6 cases of fraud were recorded in 2019. Here's Matt Hancock defending the policy on ITV.
There is some concern, and it's surely you would agree legitimate concern about some groups in society about not having the relevant photo ID at the moment. I mean, that's surely going to disenfranchise people, won't it? I mean, look, the figures say 47% of black people don't have a driver's licence compared to 26% of white people. I mean, there is a real danger, isn't there, that you could ultimately prevent sort of key constituents in society from having their say.
No, it's about fairness. It's about making sure that when people do something as important as voting, then they are who they say they are. And that we've piloted this, we've looked at it in great detail, we're committed to making it happen. And I think, you know, people across this country want to know for sure that elections are fair, and this is just one measure to make the country a fairer place.
But apparently only 6 cases of voter fraud in the last election.
Well, I think that's 6 cases too many. And I think that you'll find there's very, very strong support for the principle that our elections should be robust. It's just one example of important changes to improve the country, to make it fairer.
Sorry, that was obviously a Sky clip, not ITV. He was not speaking to ITV, as I said in my introduction. Now, that argument is just so ridiculous. For one, this idea, 6 is too many. Apply that to any other area of policy which the government writes. You know, the austerity, which the British Medical Journal said killed 120,000 people or led to 120,000 unnecessary deaths. It's 6 examples of voter fraud is a real problem. 120,000 people who die unnecessary deaths because of austerity. Well, we were just cutting the deficit, you know, we're just balancing the books. The other part of that argument, which I think is, bizarre. Well, it's not bizarre because I can see what he's doing. It's incredibly cynical. Is this idea voting is very, very important, so we should make it hard. Now, the conclusion should be the precise opposite. Voting is very, very important, which is why we should make it very, very easy. We should make sure there are no barriers to voting whatsoever. Because even in these proposals, they're saying it won't just be a passport or a driver's license. There might be other ID which is acceptable, and also you will be able to apply to your local authority for a free, piece of ID. So that they are trying to remove some of the barriers from it. I think only to make this acceptable so they can pass it through Parliament. But what you are creating, undoubtedly and inevitably, is a barrier to voting. And if you create a barrier to vote, that by definition makes it harder to vote, which means by definition less people are going to vote. So it is. You can look at the data about how this is disproportionately going to affect different sections of society, and we should. That's incredibly important. But the most obvious thing to say here, and the most, irrefutable thing to say here, is this creates a barrier to voting. Why would you want to do that when there is no problem to begin with? Ash, I want your take on this particular policy. There's obviously cynical motivations for it, but I also feel like the Tories are probably going to get away with it.
Well, I think it raises an interesting question, which is that if the Conservative Party are the new party of the working class, which is what a lot of the hot takes have been saying in the past week, then why are they pursuing a policy which will make it much more difficult for low-income voters to cast their vote? It can't be that we've got this like really weird idea of working class, which is coded as older homeowner, and we've stopped thinking about working age people on actual low incomes, have we? And maybe that's that exact cohort of voters who Labour have been invisibilising and traipsing after, those older homeowning voters. I just think that what this speaks to is the fundamental paranoia at the heart of the modern conservative project. Because on the one hand, they are absolutely riding high in the polls. They dominate the legislature, but they're looking at a generational cliff edge where they know they've lost the bulk of working age people, and they cannot attract the support of people who are actually on low incomes and don't have asset wealth to fall back on. And so that's why you see this measure, which disenfranchises low-income people, disenfranchises first-time voters, and disenfranchises disproportionately people of colour as well. It's because they look at the shifting demographics in this country and they're scared. This isn't the bold swagger of a confident Boris Johnson who's, striding around the red wall like a colossus. This is a deeply paranoid and afraid political project.
Max counter with £10. I don't support voter ID at all, but this may actually be an own goal for the government. The process of obtaining ID may actually discourage older voters who may be more inclined to vote Conservative. I think older voters are, I think they tend to be more organised because they tend to be less chaotic. For me, I think the barrier to voting here is going to be, I know I probably lose stuff less as I get older, but, especially when I was in my 20s, I just couldn't, I'd lose my ID all the time. So it could easily be the case that, in the 2 weeks before the election, I just lost it and forgot to replace it. That to me is the barrier. It's more people with chaotic lives than anything else, which I think will, benefit the Conservatives, which is why they're pushing this through. Let's wrap up there. Ash, it's been a pleasure to be joined by you on a Wednesday. As a change, you'll be back on Monday, I trust.
Oh, thank you for having me back. You exiled me from Tysky, but I've won a place in your good graces again.
I've come crawling back for more with my tail in between my legs. We are going to wrap up there. Cryogenically frozen, not carcinogenic frozen. Important to remember. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.